Right. So, hello everyone, and welcome to Brisbane Open House. Thank you for turning up today. Um, Buckle your seatbelts because we're going to be in for a storekeeper's tour to hell. And the reason I chose this title was because of a pun on a famous convict poem called "A Convict's Tour to Hell" by Frank the Poet. And he was a convict poet who did numerous poems, including the infamous Moreton Bay poem called Moreton Bay, or The Convict's Lament. That's also attributed to him as well. So it's a bit of a pun on that sort of title. However, and of course the subtitle being Life of a Commissariat Storekeeper at Moreton Bay from 1826 to 1829. So I'll be focusing today on the second storekeeper, a man by the name of Skene Craig. Funny name, but a very interesting person to the history of the Moreton Bay settlement. Someone who needs a lot more recognition. Now, as a brief overview, this is the role of the Commissariat's officer, according to Governor Brisbane himself in his Commissariat regulations of 1825. And what's very clear is the role that the Commissariat office was to play in keeping control of the rations at Moreton Bay. And that was the most important task because they didn't want convicts starving. Because with starving convicts, it meant that convicts would go hungry, which meant they weren't as productive to the needs of the settlement, such as building buildings you see like what you see here today. So very, very important role that they played, and really it was essential, their role. And as you can see, it wasn't the most easy of jobs. So here is a list of the Commissariat officers at Moreton Bay, and the one I'll be focusing on today is, as I said before, the second one here. And he was in charge for about 2.5 years in some of the most challenging conditions you can think of. So the Commissariat officer here, this is the only photograph we have of him. And this is from the State Library in Victoria. And because what happened was when he finished off his time as Commissariat officer of Moreton Bay, he ended up in Victoria, particularly in Melbourne. He was one of the key pioneers of Melbourne in the late 1830s. And there is his picture. Very stern-looking man, but that's because of his Presbyterian upbringing. Little's known about his early life. He was born in Aberdeen, Scotland, in the early 1800s, 1803. Question mark, because of course these things were a question mark because it's based on christening rather than actual birth record. So what we know of is that he ended up in Sydney around the early 1820s as a member of the Commissariat department. And it was quite common for people who had worked in the Commissariat department within Britain itself to end up in the colonies, and that was the case with Craig. And here is a sample of a letter that is part of the Colonial Secretary correspondence. The State Library have done an incredible job in not only digitising these records, but also transcribing them as well with an army of volunteers, very similar to what you see with Trove, for example. And this is an official letter saying that his passage to Moreton Bay was requested on the 30th of August, 1826. So he most likely arrived around September, and his main role, again, and he arrived on the Amity, very famous vessel, of course, and Amity Point. And it was the Amity where they would establish the first settlement in Redcliffe in 1824. And here is the conference that will be this year commemorating the 200th anniversary of that. Cheap plug. So, and on that is details on where to book and everything. So we come to his main role, and this would have been his main role. Seems pretty boring, really. Just a vanilla record of description of provisions, quantity, but the most important thing is number of days calculated to last. That's the most important thing to look at, because that would determine whether you would run out of food or not. And the main focus is on, that's a bit of a mistake. That should be flour, actually, not sugar. My bad on that one. But anyway, so beef, pork, and flour. Beef and flour was really the main staples at these settlements. And so if you ran out of goods of those materials, that could affect the viability of the entire settlement. So it was very important keeping control of those resources. However, Craig had a problem, and that was self-sufficiency, because you have to remember the climate is very different here compared to Sydney. In Sydney, they could grow wheat, but they couldn't in Brisbane. And that was a real big problem for the settlement. So instead, they decided to grow maize. However, the problem with growing maize across at South Bank was there were a bunch of angry Indigenous people, aided and abetted by convict runaways, who decided to raid these maize fields. And they did so on regular occurrence too. It wasn't like they did it once. It was more than once, and caused some of the earliest skirmishes between Europeans and Indigenous people within this area, and some of the only skirmishes, actually. Now, what's most interesting about the top letter is mentioning of the treadmill already, which hints at the fact that the windmill itself was built by around 1827, based on this letter. But the problem with the windmill was it didn't really work properly. So that's why in this letter here, this excerpt of Craig's correspondence with the Deputy Commissary General James Laidley, who was Craig's official boss in the Commissariat Department in Sydney, that this is the plan, but the best played plans of mice and men was a problem. So that's why you're starting to see hints at the building program that you start to see manifesting itself by the time this building was complete. There was a problem also, and making matters worse for Craig, was inappropriate locations to store all these rations for a growing settlement. Because the numbers you'll see in the statistics later on in this presentation, it was a big problem because the numbers of convicts had exploded, which meant that the places to store this stuff was becoming overcrowded. So they decided in desperation to establish a temporary magazine, which was another term for this store, was magazine, because that was where the ammunition was stored for the military. So they wanted to store it in a much more suitable location, and the hospital, which was made out of stone and brick, was much more suitable than a slab hut, which was what the original store was. And you can see that slab hut in the model just at the back behind you. Not a very good place to store your goods, let's just say. So what's amazing also, we go back actually, another really amazing thing about this record is that it's really the first time you're starting to see talk of a new store as well in these letters as well. So it's really interesting. and earlier than what Logan's original proposal was and the plans that were developed in January of 1828. So this is the actual plan that Logan put in place to solve the issue of storage of stores. This is the plan, written in stone, not quite in stone, but on paper. So let me just read this actually, because this is really, really important. Quote, the magazine at Dunwich is roofed and nearly completed. So the idea was that they would build an outpost at Dunwich, out at Stradbroke Island. And it was a way to solve the accessibility crisis that was going on as well, because ships with higher draft weren't able to get over the sandbars. So they needed an outpost at Dunwich to build ships with narrower draft in order to get across those bars. And I'll continue by saying, are finished and occupy, I propose immediately beginning the magazine at Brisbane town. And you're sitting in it right now. So that was the plan. That was the plan. Logan is prioritising the construction of the store here over and above the prisoner barracks, which you would think would be the most important thing to build. But Logan was smart, and Craig, who was the storekeeper, was smart. They realised that actually the settlement depended on food rather than accommodation at that time, because there was a looming crisis going on. So so what happens with the new magazine in Dunwich is there's an administration change, because Craig would have had people underneath him. And so, for example, Charles Roberts was one of those men, and he is sent over to Dunwich because now that's finished, to manage the stores there. But he needs someone to replace Roberts. So Craig's boss, Deputy Commissary General James Laidley, decides whom the town Laidley is actually named after. He then sends over, of course, he sends over H.D. Kemp from Sydney to take over Charles Roberts' position as a clerk, and he is one of the key underlings to Craig here. So it wasn't just. So I'm not just talking. These are actual people. These were people who were, let's just say, in middle management. Let's just say. However, there are real problems with the environment of constructing this store was incredibly violent, because to start off with, you would have had 16 members of a jail gang. These were the most hardened criminals here. So the idea was they were the ones really responsible for digging really the basis of the walls that you see around this building and making sure that this area was level. Incredibly difficult work. This was awful. Incredibly awful work. And it created a violent environment, because you're talking about some of the most hardened criminals in the entire colony of New South Wales. And things come to a head on a late September day, much warmer than today, by the way. And what happens is Brunga whacks William Perfect with the pickaxe and embeds a 3 to 5 centimetre wound in his head. Awful. Similar pic to what you see pictured here was the murder weapon. Probably not a depiction of the actual murderer though. So what happens is, but what's most interesting about the events in late September is that Craig was inspecting the settlement as this happened, as a storekeeper, which hints at the fact that he was intimately involved in the process of the construction of this building. He wanted this. In many ways, this building's a testimony to him and his foresight in ensuring that convicts were properly fed and having an appropriate place to store all the produce that was coming to the settlement. However, there was one big flaw in the plan. And that flaw came with a severe drought. So in 1828, the entire colony of New South Wales, which included pretty much most of the eastern seaboard of Australia, was in drought. Sydney almost ran out of water, and so too did Brisbane as well, almost run out of water. And because there was such poor quality, let's just say there was a lot of problems. And as you can see on this letter, you get a hint at the problems that the drought was causing. For example, there were many crops that were starting to be established, but the problem was those crops were failing because of the drought. So it meant, and if you read between the lines of this letter, you will hint at the fact that they're relying solely on shipments of flour to survive. And what he is saying is it's only available for 36 days. Think about how long it would have taken for a journey on a journey from, say, Moreton Bay, between Sydney and Moreton Bay at that time. If there was poor weather, it may well take a month in some instances. So let's just say I could sense the panic when reading this letter. He is incredibly panicked. It's the nightmarish scenario that he'd been trying to avoid with the construction of this store. However, there was a problem the problem was the severe drought and the poor conditions had delayed the project. So, for example, have a look at these figures. Just have a look. You will see that the peak numbers at Moreton Bay are starting to really occur between 1829 and 1832. And you can see the gap, the jump from 1827 to 28 and then to 29 and into 1830. Those are significant jumps in the population. So that would have made Craig's task very challenging to manage those rations. And in 1828 and 29, you're having a severe drought on top of it. It's a real problem. And one of the problems, the biggest issues, was dysentery. Dysentery was the biggest killer at Moreton Bay at this time. So in this letter from Logan, you can see that it was a real issue. And let's just say over 120 convicts died in 1828 and 29, which accounted for just over half of the official death toll at Moreton Bay, which was 220. And half of those deaths were caused in 1828 and 29 were caused by dysentery. And it's the summer of 1828-29 that is the peak of these terrible conditions. And as you can see in this report, this medical report on the below Logan's quote, the cause is quite clear. It's a lack of water, and because of that poor quality of that water, it has led to that outbreak. And it's pretty awful stuff. So Craig would have been very relieved when he gets relieved from the settlement in February of 1829. So unfortunately, he wouldn't have been here for the full completion of this building. We're pretty sure that this building would have been completed at the end of 1829. However, because of the involvement of Craig in making the changes that were necessary, it would be the likes of Hansord, who would be his follower as Deputy Assistant Commissary General, who would benefit from the hard decisions that Logan, as well as Craig as Commissariat clerk, would have made in the absolute crisis year of 1828 and early 1829. So by the time the drought breaks, which would have been around late February, early March of 1829, which is when we get most of our heavy rain in Brisbane, what happens is it completely turns around the fortunes of the settlement. All those crops that have been placed down were starting to grow. And that meant that people were being fed, convicts were being fed for the first time in a very long time. So the morale amongst the convicts has gone up. Also, the number of escapes would have gone down, because in 1828, the number of escapes was just completely out of control. And that's why most of the flogging, why there was such excessive flogging in the year of 1828, when this information was recorded, because not all of this information, unfortunately, was recorded. So we can only estimate what was going on outside of that period of 1828. So in this correspondence from both Dr. Bowman and the colonial botanist Charles Fraser, who established the garden, where the Botanic Gardens are today, by the way, these events change the settlement. And on top of that, they start to establish agricultural outposts at Eagle Farm. And throughout the rest of the history of the settlement, they are growing an abundance of crops. And they were even transporting those crops across the entire colony towards the end period of the settlement. So, and you can see a model of the gardener's cottage right here. So, with the drought ending, it completely changes the fortunes of the settlement. So, as I said before, it was towards the end of 1829 that this store was built. And the reason we know that, we're pretty certain on that date, is that in the field journals of Alan Cunningham in August of 1829, he doesn't mention this building. He only mentions the old store, that hut you see in the model there. He doesn't mention the new store or the new magazines. So that means and because of the fact that in the inscription it says 1829, we know it was 1829, but it was much more towards the end of 1829 that this was built. And it's no accident that if you go back to the information here, notice how the numbers of deaths decline from when this building was complete. That's no accident. That is definitely no accident that you see such a sharp decline in the death rate, despite the fact that the settlement had reached its peak by 1831. So that's a clear indication that this building had a very, very important role in changing the outcomes of the settlement. So, in conclusion, one could argue that it was Craig as much as Logan who saved the settlement from complete and utter failure. Because you have to think, because if you look at Craig and Logan's proposals for this store, they are exactly the same, which indicates that they would have been in close contact. And because they would have been based here in Brisbane, there would have been no need for them to correspond by letter. So they would have been probably in personal contact with one another. Logan probably informing Craig of what was going on and whether this was the right thing to do. And Craig was pressuring Sydney to provide the resources needed in order to change the circumstances of the settlement. This is important to remember. This is preliminary research. Hopefully by next year, when I'll be doing a conference at probably this building or somewhere else to commemorate the bicentenary of the relocation of the settlement from Redcliffe to Brisbane, I will be able to have more concrete conclusions. Anyway, that ends my talk. Before we finish off, I would like to once again promote the conference that's coming up in September 7th, which is around the time of when the settlement was established 200 years ago this year. So all the details, you can click on the QR code at the back for all the registration details. We would love to see you there. $65 per person. So compared to some other symposiums, it's actually relatively cheap compared to other conferences. So it's well worth going, and also make a weekend of it and do some whale watching out at Redcliffe as well, because it's still in the back end of whale watch season as well. So it could be an opportunity for a whole weekend out at Redcliffe as well. Anyway, does anybody have any questions or anything? Okay, well, no questions. Well, if you've got any questions that you're not game to ask with the recording that's on, feel free to do that at the end. Thank you.